The Catbird seat.
My name is Irwin Martin. It's been a week to the day since I decided to rub out Mrs. Uljean Barrows. Rub out, nothing more than the correction of an error. My plan is so casual and bold and risky that no one will suspect the cautious, painstaking hand of Irwin Martin, head of the filing department at Fittweiler and Schlosser, of whom Mr. Fittweiler once said, "Man is fallible, but Irwin is not." And therein lies the cunning of my scheme. No one would see my hand in this, that is, unless it's caught in the act. Her quacking voice and braying laugh had first profaned the halls of FNS 2 years ago on March 7, 1941. I have a head for days. When she was first introduced to me by old Roberts, the personnel chief.
This is Uljean Barrows, the new special advisor to the president of the firm.
I was appalled instantly.
Well, are you lifting the ox cart out of the ditch?
Such baiting had gone on now for 2 years, in the halls, in the elevator, even in my own office, into which she romps now and then like a circus horse, shouting silly questions at me.
Are you tearing up the pea patch? Are you hollering down the rain barrel? Are you sitting in the catbird seat?
It was one of my assistants, Joey Hart, who had explained what that gibberish meant.
She must be a Dodger fan. Red Barber announces the games on the radio and uses those expressions. Pick them up down south, tearing up the pea patch means going on a rampage. Sitting in the catbird seat means sitting pretty. Like a batter with 3 balls and no strikes on him.
I dismissed all this with an effort. It had driven me near to distraction, but I was too solid a man to be moved to murder by anything so childish. My outward appearance of polite tolerance impressed my other assistant, Miss Perry.
She's so annoying. It's amazing you stood up under it so well. Why, I even believe you like the woman. You know, she met Mr. Fittweiler at a party, rescued him from some drunk who had mistaken him for some famous retired Midwestern football coach. Anyway, she worked some monstrous magic on him, and a week later, he introduced her as his special assistant.
On that day, confusion got its foot in the door. Her persistent attempts to destroy the efficiency and the system of FNS. Tyson, Brundage, and Bartlett all fired. Mr. Munson took his hat and stalked out, mailing in his resignation later. Old Roberts had been emboldened to speak to Mr. Fittweiler.
Mr. Fittweiler, Munson's department has been a little disrupted. Perhaps we should resume the old situation here?
Certainly not. I have the greatest faith in Miss Barrows' ideas. They require a little seasoning. A little seasoning, that's all.
She had begun chipping at the cornices of the firm's edifice. Now she was swinging at the foundation stones with a pickaxe. I now come to my summing up. To the afternoon of Monday, November 2nd, 1942, just 1 week ago. On that day, Mrs. Barrows bounced into my office.
Boo! Are you scraping around the barrel, the bottom of the pickle barrel?
She was looking around the office, taking it in with great popping eyes, then suddenly demanded,
Do you really need all these filing cabinets?
Each of these files plays an indispensable part of the system of FNS.
Well, don't tear up the pea patch, but you sure have got a lot of fine scrap in here.
The finger was on my department. The pickaxe was on the upswing, poised for the first blow. I had to act quickly. Gentlemen of the jury, I demand the death penalty for this horrible person. This was my plan. During my usual evening walk, I would go to her apartment. If I ran into anybody, I would simply have to place the rubbing out of Uljean Barrows on the shelf forever. I would tell her I was just passing by and thought to drop in. I would buy a pack of Campbells and puff a few puffs. After the rubbing out, stub it out in the ashtray holding her lipstick-stained Luckies, and thus drag a small red herring across the trail. That evening, when I reached her apartment, I entered the vestibule, pressed her bell, and got in fast when the door opened. Her apartment door opened down the hall, and I went toward it swiftly.
Well, for God's sake, look who's here.
I rushed past her like a football tackle, bumping her.
Hey, quit shoving. What's after you? You're as jumpy as a goat.
My heart was wheezing in my throat.
Here, let me help you off with your coat.
No, I'll put it here.
Your hat and gloves, too. You're in a lady's house.
I put my hat on my coat, but kept the gloves on. I was passing by, and I recognized the address. Is there anyone here?
No, we're all alone. You're as white as a sheet, you funny man. Whatever has come over you? I'll mix you a toddy. Scotch and soda be all right? Oh, but say, you don't drink, do you?
Scotch and soda will be all right. She went into the next room. I looked around for a murder weapon. I examined a fireplace poker and then a paper knife on the desk. It was blunt. It wouldn't do. As I replaced it, I knocked a small object to the floor with a clatter. She yelled from the other room.
Are you tearing up the pea patch?
At this point, I was standing there with my gloves on, pulling a new pack of cigarettes out of my pocket, a drink being prepared for me. I became acutely conscious of the fantasy I had wrought. It was all too grossly improbable. It was more than that, it was impossible. Suddenly, somewhere in the back of my mind, a vague idea stirred, sprouted. She returned with 2 drinks.
For heaven's sake, take off those gloves.
I always wear them in the house. The idea began to bloom, strange and wonderful.
Come over here, you odd little man.
I sat beside her and fumbled for a cigarette out of the new pack.
Well, this is perfectly marvelous. You with a drink and a cigarette? As they say about you at F&S, our most efficient worker neither drinks nor smokes. The results speak for themselves.
I drink and smoke all the time. I was smoking and drinking. Not too awkwardly. And I clinked glasses with her. Here's nuts for that old windbag, Fitweiler.
Really, Mr. Martin, you are insulting our employer.
I am preparing a bomb, which will blow the old goat higher than hell.
Do you take dope or something?
Heroin. I'll be coked to the gills when I bump off that old buzzard.
Mr. Martin, that will be all of that. You must go at once.
Not a word about this.
Really?
I'm sitting in the catbird seat. I stuck my tongue out at her and left. The next day in my office, Mrs. Barrow swept in.
I'm reporting to Mr. Fitweiler now. If he turns you over to the police, it'll be no more than you deserve.
I beg your pardon? She snorted and bounced out of the room, leaving Miss Peard and Joey Hart staring after her.
What's the matter with that old devil now?
I have no idea. An hour later, Fitweiler sent for me. There I stood, head of the filing department, neat, quiet, attentive, in front of the old man's desk. He was pale and nervous.
Martin, you've been with us more than 20 years.
22, sir.
In that time your work and your manner have been exemplary.
I trust so, sir.
I've understood that you have never taken a drink or smoked.
That is correct, sir.
Yes. You may describe what you did after leaving the office yesterday?
Certainly, sir. I walked home, then I went to Schraff's for dinner. Afterward, I walked home again. I went to bed early, sir, and read a magazine for a while. I was asleep before 11.
Yes. Mrs. Barrows. Mrs. Barrows has worked hard, Martin, very hard. It grieves me to report that she has suffered a severe breakdown. It has taken the form of a persecution complex, accompanied by distressing hallucinations.
I am very sorry, sir.
Mrs. Barrows is under the delusion that you visited her last evening and behaved yourself in an unseemly manner.
What?
It's the nature of these psychological diseases to fix upon the least likely and most innocent party as the source of persecution. These matters are not for the lay mind to grasp, Martin. I've just had my psychiatrist, Dr. Fitch, on the phone. He would not, of course, commit himself but he made enough generalizations to substantiate my suspicions. I suggested to Mrs. Barrows that she complete her story to me this morning, that she visit Dr. Fitch, for I suspected a condition at once. She flew, I regret to say, into a rage and requested that I call you on the carpet. You may not know, Martin, but Mrs. Barrows has planned a reorganization of your department, subject to my approval, of course, subject to my approval. This brought you, rather than anyone else, to her mind. But again, that's a phenomenon for Dr. Fitch and not for us. So, Martin, I'm afraid Mrs. Barrows' usefulness here is at an end.
I am dreadfully sorry, sir. The door to the office blew open and Mrs. Barrows catapulted through it.
Is the little rat denying it? He can't get away with that.
I moved discreetly to a point beside Mr. Fitweiler's desk.
You drank and smoked at my apartment. You know it. You called Mr. Fitweiler a windbag and said you were going to blow him up when you got coked on your heroin. If you weren't such a drab, ordinary little man, I'd think you planned it all. Sticking your tongue out, saying you were sitting in the Catbird seat because you thought no one would believe me when I told it. My God, it's really too perfect. Can't you see how he's tricked us, you old goat? Can't you see his little game?
Several employees who gathered at the door were instructed by Mr. Fitweiler to escort Mrs. Barrows home. She made for me, but was blocked by one of them who played a little high school football. Together, they forced her out the door and into the hall, screaming, tangled in contradictory implications. Finally, the hubbub died out down the corridor.
I regret that this has happened. I shall ask you to dismiss it from your mind, Martin.
Yes, sir.
That will be all.
I will dismiss it. I walked out, shut the door, lightly and quickly returned to my department, where I examined a file wearing a look of studious concentration.